Alrighty, it's week 4, she says with great confidence and looking at the calendar. It's Wednesday, the 5th of August. Oh my goodness, how did we get to this point? So just to remind people to make sure that you read the announcement that I posted in Milo this morning. I'm feeling like we all need a bit of a break and de-stress, so I have opened the quiz up to be much more flexible. We can talk about that later, but first we welcome the super generous Danielle back again. It's so lovely to have your company. So when you and I go out to lunch, you have to order really big, so I feel like that I'm in some way compensating you for all of what you're donating to the unit.
That's fine, Em.
So over to you to talk about, great, Sarah, I'm happy that I'm making people happy having the quiz open and really flexible, and we can talk about that a bit later. So Danielle, before we start talking about the content, do you want to explain your lovely background?
Oh, okay. Here I am at the BBay wastewater treatment plant in the middle of a tank of sewage. So yes, we're going to be talking about a upgrade to a wastewater treatment plant today and the environmental assessment of it. So a little bit different to a quarry. I guess the main difference is obviously what we assess and the issues and risks involved. But you'll see that the process is generally the same, and you work through it in the same way that we worked through Medina last week. I guess one of the things that Emma's made really important in this unit is to understand the connection between careers and this area of study. And I guess one of the things I wanted to emphasize was that, you know, while I was an environmental officer and I did environmental impact assessment, to actually do development is a very broad range of careers involved. So the development itself, you know, involves town planners, architects, draftsmen, civil engineers, environmental engineers, mechanical engineers, you know, all these people who design the development. And then what you find is that the environmental assessment forms part of the scope of the development. And within that environmental assessment, you have generalists like me, but you also have specialists like botanists who do the flora surveys, zoologists who do the fauna surveys, noise specialists who often have an engineering background, microbiologists if we're dealing with things like sewage, chemists when you're dealing with water sampling, soil sampling, you know, so a whole range of different careers form part of environmental impact assessment. So even if this is not your career path, EIA, and I know there's people from all different units and all different degrees and courses here, you will at some point in your life, whether it's personal or professional, probably have an interaction with the planning and environmental system. So, you know, there's a good founding for you, and this assessment will show you a few more areas of career that you can have in the EIA process. So the first slide is just a recap of the process under MCA and the 5 key steps that we talked about last week. I don't need to go through them because we went through them last week, but I thought it was a good slide to start on to recap where we were. Okay? Onwards and upwards, as they say. Again, we went through these steps last time. The first step is the class of assessment. Blackmans Bay Wastewater Treatment Plant, it was determined to be a 2B, just like Medina was. Sewage treatment plants, wastewater treatment plants, they're quite complex developments. As you can imagine, they have quite a few issues and risks. And generally, in most cases, a wastewater treatment plant will be classed as a 2B because of the complexity of the issues we're dealing with, regardless of the size or location. Okay. And as we said last time, the classification determines the statutory timeframes and the scope of the assessment process.
Sorry, Danielle, can I ask a question quickly?
Yes.
Would there ever be an instance where, like, because this was just, like you were saying, that this was just an upgrade, was this sorry, what I'm trying to say is like, you know how you're saying like sometimes they don't require a permit. Was that relevant in this situation because it was an upgrade to an existing development?
A very good question. So as people may remember, in Tasmania, we have a relatively integrated planning and environmental assessment process. So MCA sets out requirements for when you need to do an environmental assessment by the EPA. In most cases, a development application starts the process. In some cases, environmental assessment will happen regardless of there not being a planning permit. This was a significant upgrade of the Blackmans Bay treatment plant, and the council required a planning permit. So a planning permit, again, started the process for the environmental assessment. We have had some situations where upgrades to treatment plants have not required any additional building or development in the term of the planning term of development, and so just the EPA assessment has occurred and an environmental protection notice has been issued for that development. Does that make sense? But this one was massive. So the Blackmans Bay wastewater treatment plant upgrade, it's already here in Tasmania. Does anyone live near Blackmans Bay, Kingston, Blackmans Bay? That kind of area. I don't know if I pretty much have a map somewhere, but I'm not sure if it's on the next page or not. Hang on. Aha! A map. There we go. So here at the top is Hobart, and if you go south, you get to Blackmans Bay. So that's just down here. It's a very fast-growing area. If you know anything about the development of Hobart, it's a very popular area for people to live, and it has until recently a very outdated, antiquated effluent treatment system that went down the whole of that area. So the Taswater, the company that manages wastewater treatment in Tasmania, actually did a significant amount of work to work out what to do with the issues they had with a very old system. They had small treatment plants at Margate, Electrona and Howden. All of them were not functioning at within their conditions, their environmental conditions. Most were at capacity and most were causing impacts to nearby residents, especially Margate. I don't know if anyone's been to Drew Point, which is a lovely recreational area when the wind isn't blowing towards you. But if it's blowing towards you, you usually head home because the odour is so bad. So Taswater had to look at what they were going to do about it, and they went through those one of those assessments that looks at the options for improving the system. And what they decided to do was upgrade the Blackmans Bay wastewater treatment plant and decommission the smaller plants and pump all the effluent from those areas to Blackmans Bay and treat it at this brand new upgraded facility. So that's the overall concept of this. So this process started years ago. Recognizing there was a problem, they needed to fix it, looking at the options for fixing it, working out the best option, and finally getting to the point of going, this is the option we're going with. What approvals do we need? We need a development application. We need an environmental assessment. The pipeline that was going to connect this was a separate assessment and didn't require the same level of assessment. But our focus was the actual upgrade of Blackmans Bay wastewater treatment plant. Okay, so that gives you an understanding that these things don't happen overnight, and there's always a background story to how they get to the EPA. So some of the things that obviously, again, we look at are the issues and risks from a wastewater treatment plant. In this case, we're looking at a current wastewater treatment plant and the issues and risks it already has, and what an upgrade will do in regards to those issue risks. Will they improve them? Will they make them worse? Is there potential for improvement or other impacts that haven't been considered already? The land zoning, really important in regards to planning, but also takes into account what the surrounding zoning is and what we're potentially going to affect in the future. Emissions, impacts, and not just the operation of the wastewater treatment plant, but the construction period. because obviously the issues and risks of construction are going to be different to the issues and risks of operation of a treatment plant. And looking again, like we did with Medina, what are the site-specific studies we want to do to understand the existing environment, noting that we've already got an existing plant and the impacts it's already having to the environment, and what a new development will do. Keep looking at the wrong thing. There we go. Anyway, back to the map. So this is Blackmans Bay. This is the area where the treatment plant is. You can see Howden, Margate and Electrona south of those areas. They were the areas that effluent was needing to be better treated at a different location. Now, when we talk about sewage treatment plants or wastewater treatment plants, we're not just talking about human waste. In many cases, we're also talking about industrial or commercial waste. And these usually operate under trade waste agreements with TasWater. So companies have contractual agreements with TasWater that they can take their waste to certain locations and it will be put into the system and treated along with the sewage and other waste that comes in through pipelines. Okay, so we're not just talking about human waste, we're talking about, you know, like grease trap waste. Sometimes you're talking about abattoir waste, although often they have on-site treatment. But yes, you can add in industrial stuff. So understanding what the treatment plant is actually going to treat is really important to understanding issues and risks you have to manage when you actually are operating. We have a question.
That's a really good question that you have. Yeah, you can unmute and ask it if you like, if that's easy enough for you to do. Just because that makes for a recording.
I saw on the slide before, and I saw in the recording that was on the Milo page, that it says that only guidelines that are for assessments that are bilateral are open for comment.
Yeah.
Does that mean only level 2C assessments are open for comment in terms of their guidelines?
Yes. And that's because the Commonwealth, the bilateral between the Commonwealth government and the Tasmanian government, the Commonwealth has said that when you prepare guidelines, you need to consult on them. So that's why that interlinks in with the 2C classification under which bilaterals are done. So it establishes that the most complex, the most potentially controversial assessments will have input to their guidelines, but not 2A and 2B.
And who are the sorts of people or agencies that comment on those guidelines? Is that mostly like EPA board or consultants, or is it public as well?
So when it's 2C, for all guidelines, the EPA will do informal consultation with relevant agencies or specialists. So we might talk to the Threatened Species Unit in relation to the guidelines. As with Medina, we might talk to the department's geomorphologist. But when it goes to this public consultation, it is for the public. It is for surrounding landholders, advocacy groups, you know, anyone who wants to have their say on what those guidelines should include. But the EPA will always do an internal consult with relevant parties within the department to establish the guidelines and what is necessary for making sure we get the information we need. Does that answer your question, Quinn?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
No problems. Okay, so this is Blackmans Bay. So on the right-hand side, we have the wastewater treatment plant. And what can you see to the north of the map? Housing. So we're in a relatively urban area with houses not too far away, okay? And that's one of, so yeah, zoning comes into that we've got sort of residential area to the north. We've also got a more rural residential to the west. And then around it, we have quite a lot of recreational areas, reserve areas, vegetation, that kind of thing. So that gives you a bit of context of what we're talking about. And remember, this is an existing site, okay? So the community already knows this plan exists. The community might already be impacted by issues from this site, and they're going to be an important element of this environmental assessment. And obviously, what you can see to the east is the Derwent River, okay? So here we go. Existing environment. People. They're usually the noisiest. They're usually the ones who complain. The plants and the animals don't usually. So a really important aspect of this one was to engage with the community. And Water has a really good consultation program in regards to their developments. The EPA board obviously doesn't conduct its own engagement. We do the public consultation at the advertising development application, but we encourage the proponents. We actually have a document on our website that says, proponents, if you want the best outcome, you need to engage with your community. You need to engage with those people who will be directly and potentially indirectly affected, to allay their concerns and do it early so that you manage it through the process and don't get to advertising and people scream loudly and unhappily. And I can tell you from experience that those that have engaged early and positively and supportively have had better outcome than those who refuse to engage with their community. Threatened species and communities, you saw that we had lots of vegetation in the area. The Kingborough area is very well known for its threatened swift parrot habitat. And swift parrots are associated with one or two particular species of trees. So there was the potential that both fauna, as in swift parrots, and flora, as in their habitat, gum trees, may be impacted by this development. We had to look at the current design, the current emissions, and the ambient water quality. So that's the current water quality of the Derwent Estuary based on the current operation of the wastewater treatment plant. So that's the existing environment context we were working in. We then had to look at the construction impact, so potentially vegetation removal. Were we going to impact threatened species or species that contributed to an ecosystem or to a threatened species, a fauna species? Noise, they were going to have to excavate, drill, blast for this project, and there would be an increased amount of traffic to this site. So noise was definitely going to be an issue, particularly as we had housing areas around us and single roads where there was no alternative, but the trucks and the excavators and the cars would have to use that road. Dust, obviously if you're excavating, drilling, blasting, you're going to create dust. Storm water, it's always an issue for sites that you're moving soil around, and when it rains, you're going to have runoff. And waste management, bits of construction equipment and all those things that come with having a site. Even just people's lunches and where the rubbish is going to go from their McDonald's trips. Operation, commissioning and ongoing. I don't know if you know much about wastewater treatment plants, but when you start a new wastewater treatment plant, you go through a testing system. So you don't just turn it on and it starts operating. You actually turn it on in stages, test pieces of equipment, start running stuff through it until you get to full operation. And that commissioning period can be 3 months. It can be a very long period, particularly if there are issues along the way. And the waste that will come out of that will be different to that when it's operating. Because if you can imagine, not all the stages will be operating, and therefore you might have a higher level of waste or contaminants in commissioning that you might do in operation when all the equipment is functioning and supporting the treatment of that waste. In operation, you'll have noise, you'll have odour, you'll have sludge, which is the solids from the wastewater treatment plant that sinks to the bottom of these tanks that I'm sitting in, and that needs to be removed and disposed of. You'll have chemicals. Chemicals are used in the process of treating wastewater. And you also need to have contingency management. What happens if things go wrong? What happens if you have an overflow, if you have a pipe that breaks and effluent heads out into the river? What do you do about the environment when something goes wrong? Last night, I don't know how many of you, but like us, we had blackouts. Blackouts can affect wastewater treatment plants because if you can imagine, they rely on electricity for their systems. Most have backups. What happens if the backup fails? And as you can see from the map, we needed to understand the vegetation and we Odour is a really big issue for wastewater treatment plants. I don't know how many people have been to one. Blackman's Bay was my first intimate experience with a treatment plant, and I wouldn't go to them too often. So atmospheric dispersion modelling is about understanding how odour will be created and where it will move to under different weather conditions. So if the dominant wind direction is north for the Blackman's Bay treatment plant, do you think that would be good or bad for the residents? Because when we saw the map.
Bad, because the houses were to the north.
Yeah. If the predominant wind direction is north and they have a lot of odour emissions, that's likely to impact the housing area. So we needed to understand where the emissions would be, what the dominant environment is, and where the odour might go in different scenarios. Noise assessment, obviously, for construction and operation. Water quality, biggest issue for Blackman's Bay is how was the treatment going to change the impact to the Derwent estuary? Now, nobody lives in the Derwent, but not at the moment, but you have obviously ecosystem-based impacts, but you also have users of the estuary. So recreational users, surfers, swimmers, fishermen, tourists, you know, it is a working and operating environment which you need to maintain the environment for. Dilution and mixing zones. So when effluent comes out of the pipe, it comes out in a certain location. It then disperses into the environment. So understanding what would come out and how it would disperse and when it would be safe. Effluent reuse feasibility study. So this is about, was there any point in the system where treated effluent could be taken and used elsewhere? It's often looked at in regards to agricultural uses, including the sludge, and TasWater required to have a look and see if there was any other options for them reusing effluent rather than treating it all and discharging it into the Derwent estuary. And wastewater characterisation is understanding what's going to come into Blackman's Bay. Is it just human waste? Is it going to be industrial? If it is industrial, what industrial? How much of it's industrial? How much commercial? How much is human effluent? So if you don't understand what's coming in, you're not going to be able to build a treatment system that manages that system. Make sense? Thumbs up. Okay. I'll just skip that one. Where's my other stuff? Okay. So, so we issued guidelines for this proposal, and we this is an environmental assessment report already. Oh, there we go. So the interesting thing about this one is the water monitoring side of things. So I think we've got a few marine and Antarctic studies people, so this might be right up their alley. But the biggest part of assessing Blackman's Bay was not only the odour, so we had to understand where the odour would expand to, but also the water. So what was going to come into the treatment plant, how the treatment plant would work, how and what the quality of the effluent would be. And the consultants involved did a significant amount of sampling in the Derwent estuary. If you like scuba diving, it might be some area that you can combine with a career, because we needed to understand what ecology was already there. In the Derwent estuary near Blackman's Bay is one of the last kelp forests in this area. It exists because of the wastewater treatment plant, because of all the high nutrients. We had to determine whether it was listed under the Commonwealth, whether it was whether it had all the features for listing under the EPBC Act. So that was fun. That was really interesting. And how we would manage it, because what they actually found was that this wastewater treatment plant was going to treat the water better than it used to. So this ecology, this ecosystem had grown there because of the nutrient levels that were coming out of the wastewater treatment plant, and we were actually going to improve the quality but potentially impact the kelp. So on one hand, you're going, this is great. We're going to have better treated water going to the Derwent. That's what we want. But then we had to make sure that we didn't necessarily compromise this ecosystem, which is becoming quite rare. So they're the juggles you have in these kind of situations that, you know, you want to support one thing, but you've got to support the other. The fact that they were improving the treatment was great because they were significantly expanded the capacity of this wastewater treatment plant, but they were actually able to treat it to a better level. Now, unfortunately, I don't seem to have all the pictures that I hope to have on this one. Hang on, let me just see if I've...
Sam, go ahead and ask a question.
Yeah, I was just going to say, when you're like talking about the kelp forest there, is that as legitimate of a consideration in this subsequent assessment, even though it wasn't around in the first assessment? You know, like
yeah, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
So it's been there for a number of years. The assessment would have changed if it had been determined to be an EPBC listed ecosystem or community, because then obviously we would have the issue of a potential referral to the Commonwealth. So what the proponent had to go through and the EPA had to go through in consultation with BBay was whether this community was just kelp or whether did it meet the criteria for that ecosystem community. And what we had Taswater do was understand, or an assessment of, did it meet the functions or features of a kelp forest as defined under the EPBC Act. So it was found that it didn't meet the criteria, but it was still important to look after it. You know, kelp forests are disappearing. It provides important habitat for lots of species, you know, but you have to support a wastewater treatment plant that's going to improve. And I think what we ended up doing in the end was there's little ports on the pipe that goes out. There's these little ports about where the kelp forest is, and then there's a big, you know, port at the end where most of it comes out. And what we worked out is, well, we could try and get a little bit more effluent coming in through those, or going out through those ports. Because it was higher treated, they need a little bit more effluent to support them. So if there's a will, there's a way. And engineers always have a solution, I have found. So they did lots of understanding of the environment here, where they had to go scuba diving, they had to go and look at the ecology, they had to do, I think they had to do sediment samples, water samples, they had to look at the chemical makeup of the water, obviously the chemical makeup of the effluent. And one of the biggest challenges for this project was you were taking an old treatment plant under an old water monitoring system. You were then changing the treatment plant, and you would have to transition them from an old monitoring program through a transitionary one into a new monitoring plan. And that took about 3 weeks of my time to work with the consultant to make sure we had a system that transitioned this treatment plant, because we're talking about an old treatment plant, and the new stuff would be built, and then it would be commissioned, and it would transition to a new system. So really quite a complicated process. And the engineers, I don't know how they worked out how they were going to do it, but they did. So, so the sewage treatment plant report is the same as we've talked about before. It talks about the approval process. It talks about the consultation process. Obviously, it went to public consultation. Obviously, the neighbours were most concerned about the issues that would come with it. Luckily, what they found out was that the dominant wind direction was not to the north. So it would only be in unusual weather conditions that significant odour was likely to move to the north. There was concern about visual impacts, and we left that to the council who deals with visual impacts. And I think they came to some agreement with Taswater that they would do some bunding and some tree vegetation screening to support the residents in accepting that they would have a bigger treatment plant across the road from them. You know, because, you know, people get used to what's in their backyard. They get used to a small treatment plant. They get used to a certain number of trucks or cars, and then you change that, and what you need to do is bring them along with you to understand why you're doing this and why it's important, and what you're going to be able to manage, mitigate and avoid, so that they can accept what is happening here. Obviously, they had to do lots of site-specific surveys, flora, fauna, water quality, noise, odour. And these guys actually had to do the modelling. So they had to do the complete noise modelling and the complete odour modelling to work out where the impacts might be. And what else have I got here? So the assessment itself brought all that information together, and it considered the issues and risks, how they could avoid them. Always the best idea is, if you can, avoid. And one of the great avoidance was they actually were able to design some elements so they didn't cut down some of the blue gums, which is the tree of choice for the swift parrots. So I think they avoided 6 trees, which doesn't sound much, but when you're talking about an endangered species, any tree is a good tree. So they did really well to try and avoid some impacts to the swift parrot. Mitigation is to try and manage the issues. Offsets is where you offset an impact by doing something else. It's not a thing that's common in Tasmania. The EPBC Act uses it a lot, but I think in this case, I may be wrong, my memory is slightly lacking nowadays, but I think they were going to plant some more blue gums in the landscape to offset the fact that they did have to cut some down. So that was great, happy with that. You know, it won't be something that's immediately available to swift parrots, but over time, especially as the older ones die, you have some new ones to replace them. So, but as with all these impacts, you must understand that there is always a residual impact. There will always be some impact to the environment from development. You will never have a development that has no impact on the environment. And that's where conditions manage that residual impact. You have to understand whether they're significant, and therefore how you're going to apply those conditions to mitigate and maintain that. So obviously with these guys, they had to do a construction management plan. They had to tell people how they're going to manage the construction. They had obviously that big monitoring program that they had to work on, from maintaining the current one, because the wastewater treatment plant was still operating while they built the new one. You can't just turn off a treatment plant for 12 months and while you're doing it up. So they actually had to operate and transition the system while they were still operating. They have to do noise. They had to maintain noise limits. They had operating hour restrictions. They had to, obviously, if there was a system for people making noise complaints and being able to complain about odour so that they could respond to those things. So yes, it was a very big, complex project. And as I said down the bottom here, again, as an officer, I didn't consider economic or social factors. And it wasn't my responsibility to approve or refuse. That was the board's responsibility. So they would look at the bigger picture of, what is Blackmans Bay Wastewater Treatment Plant for? What is the importance of that plant? And does those issues and risks mitigate or manage the fact that we're building and upgrading a wastewater treatment plant, and the effects it's going to have on people around it, and whether they're going to approve with conditions or refuse.
Did you have a question?
Yeah, just on avoidance. How do they determine what appropriate avoidance is, or like how does a proponent sufficiently define that? And then if an avoidance measure turns out to be not effective after the development has been done, what is the process after that? Is there any sort of follow-up from the EPA?
Yeah, I guess avoidance is something you really do in the planning stages. So remember, when we issue the guidelines, they have to give us a report, an EER or an EIS. And and that very rarely is the first report signed off. It's usually multiple iterations. And what will happen was the assessment officer will review that report against the guidelines, and as they're doing their site-specific surveys, they're getting more information about the issues and risk. and you might find that the proposal changes in regards to that, because in their mind is the fact that they need to get approval. And if they're putting their development right smack in the middle of a blue gum forest where there's endangered swift parrots, they might go, well, I'm not sure that will get over the line, so we might move it to the left, and then we will avoid the blue gum forest. What is right and what is wrong, I guess it's up to the proponents to decide how they're best going to manage the environmental impacts. Avoidance is obviously the easiest one in some regards, because it doesn't really require you to manage it ongoing. You avoid it. And as I said in the last lecture, the approval isn't the end. It's not the end product. You don't, when you are regulated by the EPA, it is not, here's your approval, have fun, we'll never see you again. The regulatory officers have a framework of regulation. So these guys here will regularly have to report to the EPA on water quality, complaints about noise, complaints about odour, and all these things. And if there are issues, they will have to propose ways to mitigate or manage. Otherwise, they can face enforcement. Does that answer your question, Quinn? I can't remember the second one.
You answered it all then. Cheers.
Okay. And Scott, do you want to say your question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, when the decommissioning the old plant, like obviously if they have to knock down buildings, would they have to get a separate EPA or environmental assessment for knocking down contaminated materials? Or is that included?
Not necessarily an EIA. So deconstruction or demolition is classed as development under planning law in Tasmania. So if you decide to demolish a house or a structure, you may need a planning permit by the council. Within the council planning framework is mitigation and management of contaminated issues. So them taking away a building may not, it depends. If it's part of the EIA process, we might have considered it as part of the construction process, and then they wouldn't need anything else. If they get through the process and it's not part of what we've assessed, they might need to go and get a separate approval from the council. It depends how they do it. Everyone does it differently. Sometimes we have developers build a shed and get the approval for the shed, and then they'll get approval through us for the plant that's going to go in the shed. So and you can't tell developers how they should manage that. They just have to be aware of what law applies and what doesn't.
So it depends on the order they decide to construct.
Yeah, it depends what they decide to construct, what they decide to demolish. I can't exactly remember what they did at Blackmans Bay, what they did and didn't take. But also, if you read MCA, I'm not sure anyone has, but there is a whole section about contaminated land and contaminated land management. And wastewater treatment plants are classed as contaminated sites, because you can see that there is a likelihood that there'll be contamination at a wastewater treatment plant. So if they start to do works that trigger the contaminated site section of the Act, they might have to go and get further statutory approvals to do that work. This is why the law students are going, this is great. It's all about the law. It's all about the law. Does that answer your question, Scott?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, cool. I should say back on that one, I know you don't think about it at the time, but decommissioning and rehabilitation actually has to be assessed at the time that you do the development, even if it might not happen for 50, 100 years. Because as I said last week, there's no chance to do it again. You know, there'll be one environmental assessment and then there'll be a regulatory framework. So even though the Blackmans Bay treatment plant is designed to operate 24 hours, 7 days a week for as long as it can, which may be 30, 40, 50 years, we had to ask them what were they going to do if they had to shut it down, and how would they rehabilitate the land. The same for the quarries, the same for any development, because you only get one crack at the environmental assessment. Then the regulatory system takes over, and they would probably have to do a decommissioning and rehabilitation plan at the end of life. And EPA would manage that decommissioning and rehabilitation, including any demolition of buildings, in cooperation with the council to make sure there was no ongoing environmental effects after the plant is no longer there, and that it's returned to a use that is appropriate. So, for instance, this site was mostly surrounded by open space. There's kind of an assumption that if Blackmans Bay treatment plant didn't exist there anymore, you would convert the land to open space. It also makes sense because, as I said, it's a contaminated site, and cleaning up contaminated sites is really expensive. And if you want to do housing in that area, you have to clean it up to a whole new level. So most kind of these kind of sites, wastewater treatment plant sites, become open space because it's the cheapest option for anyone who is moving away from that site. Once you get into housing, building, it's just money, money, money. So that's what you would expect from these sites. So they just have to tell us what they're going to use the land for and generally what they're going to do to manage that. And that's just what happens after the board makes a decision. I think you guys have gone through that. And that's just the appeal process. I don't recall this one going to appeal from my recollection. Usually I remember the appeals because I used to have to trot down to the tribunal for them. But I think this one we didn't go to appeal. And, you know, if anyone's been down to the dog park near Blackmans Bay wastewater treatment plant recently, this one actually got developed. This one got done because it was really important to do. They are now working on the decommissioning of the smaller treatment plants and the construction of the pipeline to move effluent from those areas back up to Blackmans Bay and to improve the treatment system. And apparently, according to the regulator, it was one of the most complex post-approval regulations that they've ever done. So my job was done.
It's a mind-boggling array of technical studies there. I'd forgotten what was involved.
Yes, I was hoping that I had some of the pictures of the modelling, but there's a link there to the assessment, so you can go online and have a look at the assessment report and also the, I think it was the DPMP at the time. You're on mute, Emma.
Andre asks, thank you. So in turning it into open space, would it be capped and turned into a sports field, for example? Is that the kind of thing?
Yeah, sports field, a park, usually just general open space. So you can see around Blackmans Bay, it's mostly a dog walking area. So it's just, you try and get the environment similar to its surroundings. So native grasses, gums, all that kind of stuff. But sports field, you have to do a bit more work because obviously you need to make sure that people don't come in contact with the soil. So you'd need to do lots of base layers and then you'd have to build the facilities. Most people just make it back into sort of the bush kind of environment because it's cheaper and easier.
That makes a lot of sense. Sam, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, so when you were saying, Danielle, that it was a really important upgrade and like social considerations to the board, would that be one of those considerations as well? And that would kind of determine how stringent.
So it's important for the board, but it's about, so if there was significant environmental impacts coming out of this, and yet it was really important, the board would have to make a call about whether the impacts were important enough or the social responsibility was important enough for the impacts. Most of our assessments never really came to that, but it's still an element to consider here that, you know, there were some people who potentially weren't happy about the potential that they were going to have a lot more noise for 6 or 12 months while they built the facility. There was people concerned about the increase in traffic, but were those short-term impacts more important than the long-term operation of this sewage treatment plant? Probably not. You can see how there's that balance there. Yes, for a period of time, people would be inconvenienced. There might be a bit of noise. We were able to put a framework around that. So they had restricted operating hours. There was a complaint system established. I can't remember some of the other ones, but there was conditions put in there to try to, I guess, mitigate those issues for that period of time when those people would be impacted, because the operation of the plant itself was actually going to be relatively quiet, lower in odour than its current design, because they were actually going to do a lot more enclosed facilities rather than having it like it is now, where you can see this big pond, and the effluent quality was going to be a lot better. So if you can see that short-term pain for those people mitigated and managed effectively for this long-term outcome that was going to be positive for so many more people in the area, including the residents, because they would have properly treated effluent, which is always a good thing.
Question from Scott.
On that social aspect, would the benefits for shutting down the smaller, like Margate and Howden, be part of the wider social considerations of the Blackman Bay upgrade, or would that also be part of the environment assessment process?
So the information that's given to the board includes the DPMP or the EIS. And in that document, a proponent has to explain why they're doing this development. So in this report that TasWater prepared by their consultant was a whole section on the feasibility assessment they had to do to work out what to do about the sewage issues in the Channel area. And so the board gets to read that information and take that information into consideration. As to how far that affects the decision, I can't tell you because I'm not the board. So, but this is the value of a proponent telling the board about why they're doing this, but also for the public to understand why they're doing this, so they can decide whether they really are against it for the right reasons, or they understand that this is necessary, and yes, they might be impacted and there might be issues short term for the long term outcomes. So that's really important, that even if we don't assess it, that information is available to as many stakeholders as possible, so they understand the reasons for a development and for the impacts it's going to have. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so you don't have to balance out the extra effluents coming from Blackman's Bay minus the less effluents coming from Margate.
They didn't have to necessarily state it, they just had to explain the rationality for choosing this site to upgrade, and what it would do. The positives and negatives of that choice. Yeah, but it's not like a mathematical 1 versus 1. It's about that whole consideration of the issues for the board. But for me, my job was to make sure all that information was in the report ready for the board. So this went through multiple iterations to get it to its final document, and for me to assess scientifically all the science information and to present that in a way to the board that they could understand, and for the public to understand what the issues and risks were, what the likely issues and risks were going to be, and how that would be avoided, mitigated and managed to make this a reasonable and appropriate development for the board to consider approval of, with conditions, obviously.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
So you're the person drafting the conditions in the first place that obviously the board needs to tick off on.
Yes, part of the job was to write the conditions, and writing conditions is probably one of the hardest elements of the job, because they have to be clear, enforceable, not wordy. It is very much an art form, and actually our legal officer in the EPA would actually run sessions with the staff to try and get us to understand the importance of writing really good conditions. So again, this is where the legal aspect comes in. You can't use words like "you may," if you feel like it, if it's reasonable, like reasonable sometimes, but you've got to put in conditions that can be enforced. And if they're not clear, if they're not, they're able to be non-complied with in some way, it makes it really hard. So yes, I was a bit of a sticker for conditions. That's where my love of the law came in, because, you know, I wanted them to comply, but you also, those conditions form part of the decision that is available to the public. The public can appeal the conditions. And so those conditions form part of the decision-making process for anyone deciding to appeal. So if they can't understand them, if they don't think they're very good, if they think people can get out of doing them, you're more likely to end up in appeal. And it doesn't look good either. So yeah, conditions need to be really clear, concise, and enforceable. And you don't want the regulators coming back later and saying, oh my God, I have no idea what this assessment officer was thinking. I don't know how to, you know, do compliance against that condition.
Yeah, or you do have a situation where the environment is negatively impacted and then there's no recourse to say, look, you've done the wrong thing, because the developers can say, well, you said may, so I'm sorry that all these trees are gone, but
Yep.
It wasn't clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, just remember though that the conditions aren't the be all and end all. There is a framework that sits behind that. So EMCA has requirements in regards to environmental nuisance and serious and material environmental harm. So even if someone is complying with all their conditions, if they cause an impact to the environment that is serious or material environmental harm, they can still be prosecuted. So, you know, like if something fails at a treatment plant and effluent goes into the river and it's considered as an impact, the organisation running that could still be prosecuted for that impact. So it doesn't stand alone in its own space, and that, you know, if anything happens, as long as they were complying, there's no issue. There's still a system that manages those things that may fall outside those conditions. And remember, you're doing the EIA at a point in time where you do it based on the information you have, but some of these facilities are going to operate for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And so the system needs to be flexible to respond to changes in not only the environment, but also the changes in the operations of facilities. So they can do amendments to these documents, but also there's another system that sits there and says, well, if there's something outside the realm, but it needs to be enforced, we can still do that. Make sense?
Great. Well, that is amazing timing because it's 2:55.
Awesome.
I am going to stop the recording.